We found that was only a very, very low yield indication from the aircraft, which meant they were quite safe to work on.
Now that Tony was happy about the safety of working on the aircraft, he was determined to try one more test while he was there. Tony wanted to see if he could bring A681, or at least her engine, back to life. It seemed incredible to think that after 14 years in the desert, there was any chance at all of the engine still working. But it was here that Tony's skill as an aircraft mechanic came to the fore. The exhaust plugs, fitted to prevent sand entering the engine through the exhaust ports, had either fallen out or been removed many years ago, and the bores were now filled with sand. So he took a gamble and decided to start the engine dry, with no lubrication in the bores.
When the aircraft fired up, it was a great sound, and it was absolutely marvellous to see sand come out the exhaust for 2.5 to 3 minutes with no damage. If we'd oiled the bores, I feel sure that we would never have been able to use that particular engine to fly home with.
Despite the enormous excitement of getting A681's engine to start, other observers thought you'd have to be a madman to even attempt to fly these planes.
I was determined there and then that we were going to fly all these aircraft out.
All of them?
All of them.
In the weeks that were to follow, Tony Schwert's skill and spirit were to be tested to the utmost, as Tony was determined A681 would leave the desert the same way she arrived 14 years ago, under her own power. Desolate location would be prohibitively expensive. So Tony got in touch with Ross Goldsworthy.
It started off actually that Tony told us first of all about the 6 Mustangs in the scrub there at Emu, and that he was wondering if I could go in and give him a hand to dismantle them and to remove them.
Like Tony, Ross Goldsworthy had served as an aircraft mechanic and fitter in the Air Force. Much of his experience had been gained working on Rolls-Royce and Packard Merlin engines, which were the type installed in the Mustang.
I had a big old Army Blitz, which actually belonged to my brother, and it had a crane on the back capable of lifting 3 ton. It took me 10 hours to get to Emu. It's a 170-mile drive, and with the Army Blitz, of course, we could negotiate the 40-foot high sand hills to get into the area.
Tony and Ross realized that if they were going to get A681 into the air, they would need to cannibalize many components from the other 5 Mustangs, and only basic engineering equipment was available.
This is the gantry that we constructed out of the old Emu control tower, and waste material which we welded some Lincoln Bomber tail wheels to. We put an RSJ across the top as a beam, and that was able to support a block and tackle.
Now the work began in earnest.
These aircraft had been left standing with water in the system. We found severe corrosion problems with all the water pipes, and so major leaks was the real problem to us, and required extensive work in regard to sleeving most of the pipes with large radiator hose type material and clamping at the ends.
The same cooling system gave Ross a chance to demonstrate his resourcefulness and ingenuity.
The other major problem was we had pinholes, various little fine pinholes in the aluminium pipes, and the only thing at my disposal at the time was little tiny self-tapping screws and cardboard off various Weet-Bix boxes and things like that. So an attempt was made to try and seal the cooling system by this method. And after several attempts, we did succeed. Another problem we had was the mixture of the engine, and we had considerable trouble with the idle mixture being miles too rich. There was a possible chance that it would foul up the spark plugs for one thing, which would be very dangerous. And so we ended up pulling out the blinking carburettor and taking it up into the cookhouse where we were living. And Tony and I spent a day and a half or so trying to repair this carburettor. Although we attempted to repair this problem, we really didn't succeed. And so mixture strength was far too rich at the idle, and we just had to be content with that situation.
By this time, Tony and Ross had spent nearly a month alone in the desert. And with the heat, the isolation and depleted supplies, the struggle to keep Tony's dream alive was slowly fading.
Isolation does have its own problems, particularly from an injury point of view. If something was to happen in a place like Emu, there was nobody to draw on to fly you out or give you medical attention. It was really a two-man show, as it was there, with Ross Goldsworthy and myself. One just had to look after oneself.
It was also at this time that Tony's father, Charles Schwert, was becoming increasingly concerned.
During the whole time, I had a fear for Tony's safety, particularly in view of the fact that he was up there for a whole month on his own, and we had not heard from him.
Charles immediately organised a support team to join Tony and Ross, and the arrival of this team had a rejuvenating effect. Charles' organisational skill and drive lifted many worries from their shoulders, and with so many extra hands to help, work proceeded at an amazing rate. One of the first tasks Charles and his team undertook was the setup of communications with the Flying Doctor Service should any problems occur. Meanwhile, each time the giant Packard Merlin engine exploded into life, it seemed to bring Tony's dream a little closer to reality. Yet Tony and Ross were not going to be rushed. After each test, they continued to check, dismantle, replace, test, and check again. By now, the excessive heat over 120 degrees Fahrenheit was causing delays working on the aircraft. Tony, Ross, Charles, and all the team had to start early each morning, and by midday, they were forced to take shelter and wait till early evening to resume work. They pulled canvas across the top of the gantry to provide shade, wore socks on their hands to hold spanners. But they persisted, and Tony was now ready for his first test flight. But there was one more test still to be done. The aircraft was anchored securely to the ground by a manila rope 1.5 inches thick, and Tony prepared to run the engine up to full power.
We created a man-made dust storm on this run. It would have been 3 or 4 miles across and about 8 miles long. And I think it wound up around about 5,000 or 6,000 feet high. The particular power that we tested it at for some 15 minutes was far in excess of what they were flown at in the RAAF. In actual fact, we actually tested it at its top limit. The reason for that was if it could take that sort of loading and maintain its integrity, then there'd be no problem with it all flying home.
The following morning, Tony left on his historic flight to Cooper Pedy using a small dirt track for navigation.
I didn't find anything really difficult providing you followed the pilot's handbook.
With A68-1 in more civilized surroundings, Tony returned to Adelaide to make arrangements for the final stage of the resurrection. In order to obtain the necessary documentation, Tony applied to the Department of Aviation, and this routine inquiry was to provide a remarkable irony. For the department officer was none other than A68-1's original test pilot, Jim Schofield.
I heard that Tony had arrived at Cooper Pedy from Emu, which was a complete surprise and something of a shock.
to think that he'd done that without any approvals of any sort.
I remember very well Jim Schofield, who was the who was in charge at the time. He was most alarmed and said that, well, you've done it now, and I agreed. I said, but I have a lot of money tied up there, and you know, we weren't getting anywhere along the normal channels of communication, and somebody just had to take the bull by the horns, and that was the only way that I felt we could get some action. That was to fly it from Emu to Cooper Pedy.
Jim Schofield warned Tony of the consequences of his actions, but at the same time showed bureaucracy can put on a more benevolent face.
On the other hand, we also had a role to promote aviation, and I was very happy to dig out my manual of Mustang pilot's notes and the like and lend them to him, and arrange to examine him on his engineering knowledge of the Mustang before he could fly it any further.
I think not only Jim but other people in the department realised that the aeroplane must have been airworthy and must have been able to fly the particular type of aeroplane, namely the P-51. Otherwise it would never have got from Emu to Cooper Pedy. And I think generally in the department, the fact that they've been subjected to atomic bombs was their main reason for reluctance in getting things moving earlier.
Unaware of the stir she was causing in Adelaide, A681 was being groomed for her epic flight. Ross took the opportunity to correct some faults which had plagued them at Emu.
And then we discovered a petrol leak in the engine, which was quite alarming because it meant that the underside of the aircraft became awash with petrol. And in checking out, we found that the diaphragm had ruptured in the fuel pump. And so we had to get a new fuel pump up. A lot of parts were interchangeable from DC-3s, right? So it was necessary then to get a DC-3 fuel pump and fit it to the aircraft. We had another look at the carburettor, but couldn't really do anything about the tune of the carburettor.
At the same time, a VHF radio was installed and the plane was given a general spruce-up. Organizational skill. He gathered together a team of engineers and flew them up to Emu. He arranged for road and rail transport to ferry the remaining aircraft back to Adelaide. The Department of Supply had only extended the deadline by a couple of weeks, and the fact that all 5 Mustangs were dismantled, loaded and transported within that time was a triumph of engineering and logistics. These remaining Mustangs were then shipped to America to be converted into twin-seat executive aircraft. Meanwhile, Tony had passed the engineering examination required by the Department of Aviation, and the way was now clear for him to make the final flight from Cooper Pedy to Adelaide. To escort Tony home, Jim Schofield arrived in Cooper Pedy, and at last he was reunited with A681.
Well, when I first saw it, I must say it brought a warm feeling to my heart. I think that it had come back into